Okay, so let's head down to part two of this lecture about the Articles of Confederation. This is the more important of the two. Now that you've had a kind of glance at what the government looked like and what its powers were under the Articles of Confederation, let's have a look at whether or not this was a successful government. Now, I think many of you know from the past, you've been taught that the Articles of Confederation was a failure, as the story goes, it wasn't able to meet the needs of the country at the time, so that's why we haven't, some people decided to draft a new constitution, and that's the constitution we have today. That's a simplistic narrative, and like I always say, it's important to re-examine those simple narratives that we're taught, especially in elementary and middle school. So let's look at this as a debatable question. To what extent did the Articles of Confederation allow the national government to address the new country's challenges? To get at this, there are two quotes I want to show you. They were both from 1787, one from Richard Henry Lee, who was the former president of the Confederation Congress, and another from Alexander Hamilton of Broadway fame, but also one of the, quote, founding fathers of the U.S., and not a big fan of the Articles of Confederation. Here's Richard Henry Lee's quote. Check it out, read it for a few seconds. You can press pause and then play again when you're ready to move on. And here is Alexander Hamilton's quote. Check it out, read it, press pause now, and then press play when you're ready to move on. So as you can see, quote A, Richard Henry Lee's quote, is pretty optimistic, a cheery kind of assessment of life in the U.S. under the Articles of Confederation. Quote B, on the other hand, is Alexander Hamilton's much less cheery view of the U.S. In fact, for him, things are pretty bad, almost catastrophic. And so we have to get at this. What is going on here? Why these two very different, opposing viewpoints about life in the U.S. under the Articles of Confederation? So as you listen to this lecture, in your notebook, make a T-chart that looks like this. On the one hand, of the one side of the T-chart, write support for quote A. On the other side, support for quote B. And as you take notes, write down key pieces of evidence that might support Richard Henry Lee's version of life in the U.S., the more cheery, optimistic kind of perspective, and then anything that you learn that might support Hamilton's much more negative take on life in the U.S. So a T-chart, bring it to class on whenever you're told to finish this quote by watching this lecture by. Bring it to class, and we're going to use it in class as and take some further steps with this information. So moving on, we're going to look at several case studies of the Articles of Confederation. 5, in fact, if I'm not mistaken, things that happened between 1781 and 1787 during the time of the Articles of Confederation that will help us answer or get to the bottom of those two competing quotes and give you evidence. Here's case study number 1, and it's about finances. Here's the problem. So Congress owed a bunch of money. The Confederation Congress did, the national government, to a bunch of Americans, individual, people, and especially who owned government bonds, almost $35 million worth of government bonds. They had to pay those back, and also $10 million was owed to foreigners. France was owed some money, and a bunch of other people abroad were also owed some money by the national government. So here's the problem: the government has a bunch of debt to pay off. The national government does. On the other hand, Congress, as you know from part 1 of this lecture, could not levy taxes, so it couldn't independently raise any money, and states were often reluctant to, voluntarily give money to the national government. So given that, the national government found it very difficult to pay back its debts. As a result of all of these unpaid debts by the national government, especially a couple of kinds of people in America were chagrined. Merchants and large planters and other people who were the kinds of people who owned these bonds were worried that they were not going to get repaid. They were also more broadly worried about the government's reputation abroad, internationally. Banks in London and Paris were going to be reluctant to do business with the government of the United States and more broadly with merchants in the U.S. if the credit of the United States was so bad because it could not pay off its loans. This was scary to a lot of people who did business internationally, especially. And so they were worried and looked for a way out. Another issue that came up during this time period had to do with trade, just broadly, and both domestic trade, as I'll start with, and international trade. So first, let's look at domestic trade. Remember that under the Articles of Confederation, the states pretty much had the power to do whatever they wanted to do. The national government had very little power, and it had no power to regulate business or commerce between states or within states, or even between the U.S. and other countries. That meant that state governments had the power to tax and regulate imports from other countries, but also from other states. So what happened was you started getting different states taxing the imports from other states. And what resulted was this resulted in an interstate tariff war. One state would raise tariffs on, say, rice from South Carolina. So South Carolina would raise tariffs on, tobacco from Virginia, and and so on and so forth until things, the squabbles just never ended. So the states were often at each other's throats because of their power to regulate the trade between them and the other states. Internationally, the problem was pirates. In the high seas, it used to be that the British government, the British Navy, the most powerful navy in the world, would protect American ships. In the Mediterranean, especially near northern Africa, where piracy was most a problem. Well, after the Revolutionary War, the Americans no longer had the protection of the British Navy. The national government also did not have the money to pay off pirates, which is what they usually wanted, was a ransom or tribute, rather, to that then they would receive in return for guaranteeing peaceful passage, safe passage of American ships into Europe through the Mediterranean. Well, the American government did not have the money to do that, as you know. And it also didn't have the power to regulate commerce between the states to stop that domestic squabbling between the states. So with no army or navy or money to pay off the pirates, no power to regulate commerce, the issues, both domestic and international, surrounding trade persisted until the end of this period, pretty much unresolved. Interstate tariffs made it difficult to do business in the new country because the national government couldn't do anything about the squabbling between states. And piracy led to a loss of merchandise and very high insurance rates, especially for merchants, people who did business, people in Boston and New York and Philadelphia who did business overseas. Then there was a case of foreign relations. So let's talk about the problem. The Treaty of Paris ended the American Revolution in 1783. As part of the treaty, the United States Congress agreed to allow loyalists. These were the people who were still loyal to Britain during the war, many of whom had to flee in its immediate aftermath. They agreed that they would allow loyalists to sue in American courts to regain the property that usually was confiscated during or immediately after the war by state governments. However, many state courts, remember, there was no national court system, so all this had to happen in the state courts, and the state courts, state governments simply refused to allow their courts to hear the pleas of loyalists to try to regain their property. The national government wasn't able to enforce the treaty that the agreement that it made with Britain to allow loyalists to sue because, again, under the Articles of Confederation, the national government had no power to force the states to do anything. And so, as a result, a lot of people around the country, not just loyalists, but also, wealthy elites who had been patriots, and in support of the American Revolution, they worried that property wasn't being really protected under the current system, that loyalists not being allowed to sue in court to receive their property, to get their property back, was just like the beginning of a slippery slope of a very loosey-goosey kind of way of looking at property that might end up in hurting Americans who had supported the war and who also owned lots of property and wanted to protect it. Another problem with respect to foreign relations was closer to home in the western parts of the country. If you look at the map, you'll notice that Spain, after the war, kind of regained the territory of Florida, and was kind of in control of the what is today the kind of mid sort of Great Plains region, down all the way down to New Orleans. Spain posed a threat for two reasons. One, they were hanging out in the western parts, especially in the southwestern part of the U.S., and supporting Native Americans there in an effort to kind of try and keep the Americans from expanding into their own territory. Spain also, again, worried about this kind of growing country, this new and very quickly growing country of the United States, encroaching upon its own territory, also refused to allow Americans to use the Mississippi River or the port of New Orleans, which was a very important port if you wanted to travel from the western part of the country into the Gulf of Mexico, and from there trade with the Caribbean or out into Europe. The U.S. government had no power to enforce treaties, so it was often just ignored by foreign powers. It could, try and come to agreements with other countries, but all the other countries, especially the great powers, like Britain and France, and to a lesser extent Spain, which was a kind of a power in decline, just ignored the national government, ignored the U.S. government, because they knew that it was a toothless tiger. It had no power to enforce any of its agreements in the states. And so it did very little to kind of try and budge on this issue of New Orleans and the Mississippi River. As a result, settlers in the southwestern U.S., especially down here, were nervous about Native Americans, right, that were being supported by the Spanish, and they were also unable to trade, to move their goods down the Mississippi into the port of New Orleans, which was really bad, not just for farmers in that area, but also for merchants, people who were wealthier and did a lot of good, wanted to do more and more business along the western frontier. It was hard to do business, that kind of business at least, with the Spanish being reluctant to open up that very important waterway of the Mississippi and the port of New Orleans. Then there was the case of Western lands. These lands here were owned, were ceded by Britain in the Treaty of Paris. So as a result of the Revolutionary Wars, the Revolutionary War, the United States not just was the original 13, colonies. The territory of the U.S. also included all this big chunk of land. The issue, or one issue, was that in the Treaty of Paris, Britain agreed to move out of there. They had soldiers in some of these western forts way out in the west, and they agreed to move, allowing for Americans to kind of move into that territory unencumbered by the presence of the British military. But the British refused. They just kind of decided they weren't going to do it. They're going to take their time, and what are you going to do about it? And the British also continued to support Native American groups out in the West because they had been allies with a lot of these groups for a long time. the British government had. And during the Revolutionary War, they had also kind of solidified a lot of these friendships in an effort to try and secure enough allies to beat the American patriots. The British also were, still in control of what is today Canada, and wanted to make sure that there was a strong buffer between them and the United States. So they had a stake in wanting in keeping soldiers, firmly within American territory, trying to keep this country from getting too powerful too quickly, just like the Spanish in the Southwest and in Florida. Well, again, with no army to do anything about it, no money to do anything about it, the national government of the United States, under the Articles of Confederation, was unable to work through these problems. As a result, it made it much more dangerous for settlers to move into the Northwest, and it made it difficult for land dealers, people with, usually, people with a lot of money who invested in land, bought it cheap to sell for higher prices once these lands were opened up. They were kind of holding on to pieces of property that they couldn't sell because, or at least they couldn't sell at as high of prices as they wanted to because of the British and Native American threat along the frontier. So this made them mad. There was another problem, and that was the problem of what do you do with all these new lands that don't belong to any of the states now that they've given up, the states have relinquished their claims to those lands. What do you do with them? How do you dispose of these western lands gained by the Treaty of Paris after the Revolutionary War? The Confederation Congress did have the power over those lands that were not owned by any state, land that you might call public land. And they passed a couple of laws dealing with those lands. The Land Ordinance of 1785 and the much more well-known Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Several things happened as a result of these laws. Look at these. You see over here, you'll notice these little squares. Everything is in patches. If you were to kind of zoom out, look at a satellite picture of the United States, you'll see that almost the entire country almost the entire country is divided up into, at least beginning from in the Appalachian Mountains and all the way to the west, is divided up into square mile sections. This was a result of the land ordinances of 1785 and 1787. Everything was divided up into square mile sections. Each square mile section was sold at auction. Also, the laws required that one of those sections would be reserved in every little town for a public school, and I'm talking here about these land ordinances were dealing with this chunk of land here, the Northwest or the old Northwest. The other thing that these laws did was establish a way for new lands to become states. First, they would go through a process of becoming a territory. So the Northwest Ordinance established several territories in that part of the country. Once 5,000 people lived in that territory, 5,000 free male inhabitants, not enslaved people, but you'll see how that wasn't an issue in a second. Then a legislature, territorial legislature would be established to kind of run the territory. Once the population reached 60,000, the people would convene a convention to establish a state constitution and then apply for statehood. And they could do so as long as the constitution that they created a democratic or republican government. The Land Ordinance and the Northwest Ordinance also guaranteed the freedom of religion, trial by jury, property rights, and other rights that Americans took for granted in the older parts of the country. And perhaps most importantly, the Northwest Ordinance banned slavery in the Northwest Territory, this part of the country here. What's the result here? I mean, what's why does this matter? Well, the Northwest Ordinance in particular created what you might call a blueprint for all future states. Um, all future states would be equal to old states, right? And that sounds blasé and perhaps obvious to us now, but that had to be, they had to kind of, this thinking had to evolve away from the old way of thinking, which was there was, a country, it would take over new land, those new lands would become like colonies and would be inferior to the metropole or the mother country. Well, this is a very different way of looking at new acquisitions or acquisitions of new territory. This gave the new parts, any new land acquired by the country, the same status as the old regions of the country, the old states. And people in those new states would have exactly the same rights and privileges as people in the old states. Okay, finally, the last case study is that of popular unrest in the middle of the 1780s. The problem was that small-time farmers were struggling with huge debt. And because the British, for a while weren't trading with Americans and closed off their colonies in the Caribbean, the loss of markets after the war, nobody to sell to, or fewer people to sell to. Now, remember that the state governments were the ones that had all the power. The state governments, and remember that after the Revolutionary War, state governments became very democratic. In many state governments, there was a quick response to this public outcry by small-time farmers, who were, after all, the majority of the people in these states. And one of the things these state governments did, aside from doing things like getting rid of debtors' prisons and putting holds on debt payments and things like that, is they issued paper money. And they made paper money legal tender in repayment of debts. Now, what this did was it allowed small farmers to repay their debts at a fraction of the original cost. And this was bad for people who were owed money, so the creditors of the country, of the states. Merchants, bankers, and other people, large landowners, for example, who tended to be the people who would loan money to others. They were being forced to accept very much devalued paper money. It wasn't worth the number on the paper in lieu of gold and silver, which was real money back then. Now, if you want to learn more about that, if you're not understanding this, I have another handout for you to look at that's attached and to Manage Back. Anyway, there's that. But also, there was this. This is Daniel Shays. Daniel Shays was a Revolutionary War veteran, a small farmer in western Massachusetts, the birthplace, or Massachusetts being the birthplace of the American Revolution, who instigated, along with some others, an uprising of indebted farmers in Massachusetts that came to be known as Shays' Rebellion. Now, these farmers were tired of being deeply in debt, of losing their land to creditors who they owed money to and who foreclosed on their lands when they couldn't pay back that debt, of being tossed into prisons for owing money, which was very common back then, of being charged high taxes by the state government, which needed it to pay back its own debts, etc. And so Shays' Rebellion, or the Shaysites, the people who joined Shays' Rebellion, they attacked state government in symbols, state courts, state armories, where the state militia kept its weapons around the western parts of the country, of the state. These were symbols of Massachusetts' political power, but also symbols of the elite in the eastern part of Massachusetts. This was very much a west versus east, yes, east coast versus west coast kind of conflict On the East Coast, you had the people with money, the most money, the large merchants, the people with the most power. In the western parts of Massachusetts, where Shays' Rebellion started, you had all the kind of smallest farmers, the poorest farmers, the people who felt less powerful or almost powerless. And so Shays' Rebellion was definitely that as well. But it was definitely an uprising to address the issue of indebtedness on the part of small farmers. Anyway, under the Articles of Confederation, remember that the state governments have most of the power. They had the power to issue paper money, which was used very liberally by the states. And this was, democracy at work, right? When they issued paper money, this was good for the majority in those states, and even though it was bad for the minority of people who happened to have a lot of money and were owed money. The result of all of this popular unrest, from just the people kind of calling out for help and being heard by their state governments, the issuing of paper money, but even more so, the this meant that democracy was working in the states that adopted paper money, and again, that was good for the majority of people, but bad for the elite in those states. Shays' Rebellion, on the other hand, was a whole different animal. It made people very nervous about how much this democratic spirit in the country was leading to unrest and chaos, and there was a lot of concern that the government wasn't equipped to do anything about the impending chaos that would be generated by the impoverished masses of small farmers who might continue to call for more and more relief. Anyway, back to the two quotes, remember. Here's Richard Henry Lee's quote. Here's Alexander Hamilton's quote. You took some notes. Hopefully you have evidence to support both sides. One side might have more than the other, and that's okay. But you'll have some evidence to take home, or rather bring to class with you, so that in class we can then work with this material.